This show is listener supported. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is Season 4, Episode 13, Donna. Before we get started, I just want to let you know we've got a fall book club coming up. Make sure you visit the Adoptees On Facebook page to request to join the book club discussion group. You'll find out what we're going to be talking about, and it's going to be a pop-up club again. We'll be live for a few weeks this fall, then we'll archive the group until it's time for our next book club. We've been talking all about relationships in Season 4, and today is a bit of a twist on that theme. The definition of relationship is simply a connection. So what happens when you are so hopeful about connecting with your first mother, but then you discover they're already gone? Today, Donna shares her story of searching for her birth family and what happens when she finds out some very sobering details of her birth mother's life. I also want to give you a heads up. We do discuss suicide at multiple points in this episode. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today, including some links to some crisis helplines, will be on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Donna. Welcome, Donna.
Hi, Haley. Thank you.
Would you start out by just sharing your story with us?
Sure. So I was born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1974, so just on the outer edges of the baby scoop era. And I came home at 8 days old. I spent a few days in foster care between the hospital and coming home. And it was a closed adoption. I also have an older sister who's also an adoptee, 3.5 years older and not biologically related. And we grew up in a household where we could talk about adoption and we could ask questions. But I think in that time period, we really had no context to talk very much about it. Very little understanding other than, for me, having a lot of curiosity. And so I did ask about it growing up. And I remember in those questions also priming my parents so they would be prepared that I wanted to do a search as soon as I could. I knew that we would get a sheet of non-identifying information when we turned 18. And I remember being frustrated about not being able to get that sooner. And so when I did get that, when I turned 18, one of the things that was most striking to me was that my birth mother was also an adoptee. And so I learned that at that time. And I remember immediately deciding at that point that I felt this lineage of loss and feeling like that had to stop with me. And so immediately deciding that I would never put a child up for adoption and that I had some responsibility toward ending this pattern. And then I did my search at 20. So between getting that sheet of information and then doing my search, my mom and I had gone to a adoption conference she told me about in Phoenix, Arizona. And I had come down from school. I had gone up to school in Flagstaff. So I came down for the weekend and we attended this. And I remember seeing and listening to panels of adoptees and birth parents and hearing about some of the complexities of search and reunion and hearing about secondary rejection and kind of realizing, this doesn't necessarily go easy or how you expect it to. And in that, I naively thought I was somewhat prepared for doing my search, which turns out I wasn't as maybe prepared as one would like to be, or be at some extent. You really can't fully prepare for this.
Well, just that already seems unusual to me, Donna, that you already had, you went to a conference when you were, early 20s. That's pretty amazing.
I think I was 18 or 19, and my mom had heard about it and told me about it and asked if I wanted to go. And I think because I was the one that was regularly asking about about adoption. So she knew I was interested.
Mm-hmm.
And she tells me this story about when I think I must have been really young, like maybe 4 years old, and we were on a vacation and we were in a cafe, and just out of the blue, I say, Mom, I just got one question. What does she look like? And my mom says, Who, Donna? What are you talking about? And I said, the woman who gave birth to me. And I'm sure she was like, what brought that up? But probably like most adoptees, you're out and about and you're looking around and you're thinking, where are my people?
Mm-hmm.
And so even at a very early age, that was going on for me.
So you went to the conference and you thought, okay, now I'm prepared, but really you weren't.
Right.
What happens next?
I had dropped out of school and moved to Washington, moved to the Northwest, and was up here for about maybe 6 or 7 months. And I went home at the holiday and had decided at that point that when I went home, I would start my search. And I connected with a search triad group in Phoenix. And there was a woman, they would link you up with a search assistant or somebody that would give support. And I met with somebody and, told her what I knew. And I was adopted through the Family Services Agency. And so her suggestion was that I make an appointment and go into the agency and ask them to read me my file. And even though it would be non-identifying, I might be able to get some bit of information that would be leverage for doing a search. And Arizona is a closed record state, so it's hard to get anything. And I still don't have my OBC. So I made that appointment and I went in, and then the story starts to unfold. You've been waiting 20 years to hear anything. and so many parts of my brain are working. There's one part that's listening for any aspect that I can use to find my people. There's another aspect that's just intrigued by the story. And then, I think all of this undercurrent of emotion that's happening. So my birth mother was the daughter of a successful surgeon. And she was one of 4 adopted children in the family. And both of my birth parents in my chart were described as emotionally deprived. So I don't think either of them had a lot of family support or stability. And my birth mother, one of the things she described, I have an idea of what it could be, but she described something happening in her teens that she said made her difficult life more difficult. And then 2 years after that event happened, her brother that she was closest to died in a car accident. And she wasn't close with her parents, so that was the family member that she was closest to, and she lost him. 2 years after that, her adoptive mother died, overdosed likely on barbiturates, possibly committed suicide. And there's a possibility that she is also an adoptee. I have 2 sources that think she might have been an adoptee, but I haven't been able to fully confirm that. But it would make sense if she was, that after a loss of a child, that she would be having a very difficult time. But that's a difficult thing for anyone. After that, my birth mother's name is Carol. Her father shortly remarried, and it was, I think it was a bit hostile at home. Both of her parents were drinking a lot, and the new stepmother was not kind or supportive. So my birth mother ended up becoming connected with a sort of spiritual community that my birth father was a part of. She started attending these weekly meditation classes that his group was facilitating. And it was an intentional spiritual community, which I call it a spiritualist commune, because they later purchased a property and it was communal living. And so she then later moved out and was out there with him. And so that's how she met my birth father. And during that time became pregnant. And she, I think at that point, was looking to have a more traditional family. I think both of them were looking for support that they hadn't had and were kind of seeking greater meaning. And at that point, I think she wasn't happy with some of the things that were going on out there. And once she found herself pregnant, wanted a traditional family. And my birth father was very passionate about his spiritual pursuits and his beliefs and was committed to this lifestyle. And so there became this divide in their relationship that they weren't really able to get past. And my birth mother was getting a lot of encouragement and support to place me for adoption outside of the commune. And my birth father wanted to keep me and raise me in the commune and communal living, and she wasn't in support of that, and didn't want to be a single mom as well. Wasn't prepared for that.
How old were they when this was happening?
She was 22, and I think my birth father, James, was a few years older, but pretty close in age.
Mm-hmm.
So in the chart, it describes really a lot of conflict regarding their decision and a lot of emotional turmoil surrounding that. At the same time, out of the community, they ended up losing the property, so there was a lot of instability in the community. Then there was another commune that, like an Essene Gnostic commune, it was the 70s. So there was this other commune, and they met with this Father Jack, and he was encouraging my birth mother to move there and raise me there, and that they would support her. And again, she wasn't having that. So ultimately, she decided to relinquish me. And again, my birth father was going back and forth about the decision, and the agency, essentially, from what I can tell in my chart, told him that if he did not relinquish his rights, I would become a ward of the state and go into foster care, and the case would go into courts, and it would be a long, drawn-out process. So ultimately, he relinquished his rights.
So was this information in your non-identifying?
So they read me my whole chart. So my birth mother had come in, and so it is basically what she was saying in the interviews between both of them, sometimes her, sometimes him, sometimes both of them, as filtered through the caseworker. And so I'm getting an insider's view of some of what was going on. The sort of second to last entry was my birth mother came back in after she had relinquished rights, and the caseworker is saying that it seemed like the emotional turmoil had calmed down and that she was doing a little bit better. And there were also some notes. So my birth father had kept in touch with the agency and periodically updated them, and also in my early teens had tried to get contact with me. And then the very last entry was my birth mother's sister, who was also an adoptee, came in for adoption planning for her 2-year-old son and was going to place her 2-year-old son for adoption. And at that point, she told them that my birth mother had committed suicide several years after she relinquished me. And so that was how I learned about my birth mother having passed.
I'm so sorry. How old were you? How old were you then?
I would have been 3 when she passed away. But the sister gave the wrong year. So she came in 83 to place her son. And I was born in 74. And I think my birth mother passed away when she was 25.
Okay, so you learned all this information while you were in the office and they're reading you this chart. What's your reaction when they tell you this?
Completely devastated. It just felt like the worst sucker punch you could imagine. And I remember reaching out and grabbing the desk in front of me just to steady myself. And then I realized I couldn't breathe, and that the wind had been knocked out of me. And then there's this sort of internal dialogue, and my world is falling apart. And at the same time, I have this part of my brain that is realizing that I'm still not able to breathe and still not able to breathe and still not able to breathe, and my lungs are not starting up again. And finally, I remember just taking my other hand and hitting my chest in sort of desperation to get my lungs working again. And luckily that worked. And then I don't really remember too much after that. I don't even know how I finished the conversation or got myself home. The next thing I remember is being home and sitting at the kitchen table telling my parents about what happened, and the three of us sitting there crying together.
So you get this news, and after that, are you still wanting to search for, I mean, if she was adopted too, like, it's kind of like, how do you find your maternal biological side? Is there, like,
Right.
and then you've got your biological father who, from that information, he wanted to keep you, but just that didn't work either. So where do you go from there?
So the first thing I did, and it's interesting having done a search, so that was early 95. So it's very different from folks that are searching now. And so I had this date of her passing. So I spent probably 13 to 15 hours in the library reading through obituaries on microfiche, looking for what I had, her first name, and something that sounds like a suicide. And when you're in a state of shock and deep grief, let me tell you, searching through obituaries is not going to cheer you up. So I did that and didn't find anything because the year was wrong, and was sort of trying to piece together any bit of information. I then called the agency and asked them to send me a copy of my file that they had read me so I could go through the details again. And, they double black it out. So they make a copy, they black it out, and then they make another copy. And so I was sitting by the window and reading this, and one section on one page, my birth mother's last name, they missed it the first time. And so they scribbled it out with pen and then blacked it out only once. And I was sitting there in the window and realized that I could read her last name through this blackout, that I could see it. And so then that gave me enough information to really start looking. I knew her father was a surgeon, and started putting it together that way. I ended up finding her youngest brother and her last stepmother. She had a few.
Mm.
And
her youngest brother was adopted as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So in her family, she and one of the brothers, they were adopted first, and then 10 to 12 years later, they adopted another girl and boy. So he was younger. And I met them and got some pictures and got a little bit of information. They gave me my birth mother's amended birth certificate, and they gave me this scrap of paper that had a name on it and an address in Ecuador. So my birth mother was born in the Panama Canal Zone, and what I didn't know at the time was that she was from Ecuador, but I knew there was some link to Ecuador. And I did try to figure out, can I go to the Ecuadorian embassy? What do I do with that? And I was just so overwhelmed that I didn't pursue that. But I met a friend of hers that was a neighbor from high school. I met some other neighbors, talked to some different people. My father was in medical care as well. He was an administrator at a hospital. His boss sang in the choir, church choir, with my birth mother's adoptive father. And they had family friends that were close to them that worked for my father. And I took guitar lessons from their son, a son of this family friend. So there was some funny connections there.
Mm-hmm.
For finding my birth father, I'm not sure if the agency reached out and connected to him or if he was looking for me at the same time. He had connected with them when I was 19. Again, and updated, I think, information or reached out to them, and I searched when I was 20. And in the course of my looking and trying to find information about my birth mother, and also trying to figure out a way that I could find information about my birth father, he ended up calling the woman who was the search assistant for me. So there are all these coincidences. So he and I had both at different times lived in Flagstaff. He had a friend who was an adoptee who owned a bookstore that I frequented when I lived in Flagstaff. He, in looking for me, called his adoptee friend in Flagstaff, Arizona, and she suggested he contact the search triad group in Phoenix. The woman who knew my backstory and was helping me happened to be the one who manned the phone lines and took this call. And since some of the story with the commune and all of that is a bit unique,
Yeah.
she realized she was talking to my birth father, and she got off the phone and she called me and said, I just spoke with your birth father, but because of confidentiality, I couldn't tell him I was working with you, but I suggested he send his information into ISRR, International Sound X Reunion Registry. So she told me I could connect with him in that way. So that also went pretty quickly.
So this is when you're 20. This is all happening in the same time frame.
Yes, that was in a few months, and at the same time, I'm experiencing just this tremendous grief and depression, and about 2 years after that, I started to come out of this state of shock and retrospectively realized that I had been in also this deep state of shock for about 2 years. So I did all of that in that condition.
Wow. Well, we're talking about relationships this whole season, and you've been looking for a connection since, you asked your mother when you're 4, like, what does my birth mother look like? Um, how are you processing this? Like you said, you're in the state of shock. You're in your early 20s, which are just, I mean, not even being adopted. That is like trying to find yourself and what are you doing with your life and all this. Like you've got a ton of stuff on you. And whoa, it just sounds so much, too much for anybody to handle.
It was a lot. And on top of that, so I have had a lifelong history myself with anxiety and depression. I can't remember not having anxiety, and I started having depression in the 2nd or 3rd grade. It became a little more intense in around the 5th or 6th grade. One of my favorite grandmothers came down with Alzheimer's disease. And what I didn't know at the time is that kind of ambiguous loss is similar to what adoptees experience. At the time, I just knew that I was having a really hard time with it, and it worsened my depression. I probably myself started having suicidal ideation by junior high, and early high school was struggling with it myself. And so then learning this about my birth mother, it just reified all of that and made it real and really exacerbated it. So it was really, really difficult.
I know this is really tough stuff to talk about. Can you talk just a little more about that? Because now I have a biological connection to someone who has committed suicide. And if you've been thinking about, I did do, I struggled with suicidal ideation, same from junior high on. And, I mean, still, it's just something that I think a lot of us struggle with, right? But what does that do when you have a connection with someone who's gone through with it?
Right. From the adoptee perspective, which I realize more clearly now, having come out of the fog, I always carried with me this sense of being fundamentally flawed and that everything is not okay. And so much of my life, I was trying to figure out why that was going on. And so finding that out it was sort of like, oh, here's proof. Things aren't okay, and they might never be okay. I basically spent my 20s in a state of moderate to severe depression. I pretty much lost the decade to depression and started to climb out of it a little bit by my late 20s. Maybe about a year and a half ago, I was having trouble again with suicidal ideation. Anxiety and depression has been my constant companion, and I was having suicidal ideation come up again in a pretty strong way. And I was thinking, what is going on? Why is this still happening? And then I started looking into it. I started searching on Google because I was afraid. When you have very serious suicidal ideation, it's scary. And so I started doing some online research, and at some point decided to put adoption into that search bar, as well as anxiety and depression. And what I came up with was this wonderful podcast called Adoptees On, and the episode with Davis, who is talking about the Paul Sunderland video and the primal wound. And that launched me out of the fog. And everything for the first time in my life started to make sense. So I had 40 some years of just being baffled by what was going on. And then I really profound for me was the Paul Sunderland video. All of it was really profound. But just hearing that adoption is trauma, that there's this aspect of developmental trauma, hearing the description of what Paul Sunderland says about that there's the rise in adrenaline and cortisol, and how that makes difficulty in focus and concentration and sleep and digestive problems. So I had really difficult digestive problems growing up. I had headaches and migraines and all of these things, grinding my teeth at night, a lot of physical symptomology that I just managed because that's what adoptees do. And then it talked about the drop in serotonin and how that impacts our ability to soothe ourselves and regulate ourselves and do mood regulation. And an aspect of that is early sugar addiction, which was totally my thing from an early age, using sugar and TV to try and manage my overwhelming feelings. And when he talked about that drop in serotonin, he talked about how serotonin helps to manage shame and that feeling of being okay. And for me, when I would have these really, really bad episodes with depression and suicidal ideation would come in, there would be this resounding reverberation of everything is not okay. And so when I heard him talk about that, to me, it was like, oh, it's just this recurrence of this developmental trauma. Something likely triggered me, and it's this drop in serotonin that I recognize from birth, that's in my implicit memory, that's locked in my nervous system. And just, so much of life started to make sense. But prior to that, it was a struggle. And I had realized that through my 30s, I realized that even though it was better than my 20s, I was emotionally white knuckling it and still not okay. And now having this information and having resources where I can hear other adoptees talking about things that are going on, I'm just putting all of these things into place and be like, oh, that makes so much sense.
Well, you made me cry a little bit. So good job. First one to do that for a while. I'm so glad you found the show and the resources, right? Like, it's just, I felt like I was going crazy and like I was the only one. And until you can put your finger on that, like, what is it? It just drives you like actually crazy.
Right.
Okay. So Donna, all this time you're searching for connection, right? And for relationship and like something to fill this. And can you just talk about that? Like, where are you now in the last year and a half that you've been coming out of the fog? And I mean, that is no easy task either. So,
Well, I was suffocating in the fog. So coming out of the fog, although not easy, and I feel like I've been unpacking my life and making a mess by just unpacking every corner. it is so much better than being in the fog because I know, I don't have that feeling anymore of like, I'm crazy. This doesn't make sense. Although I think there is this aspect of sort of cultural gaslighting
Mm.
with adoptees where you talk about it and people will say, and I have friends say, but you had a good life, because I have a good relationship with my parents and we had a comfortable life growing up, and so that should be enough to negate or wash away this trauma when it's not. And so there's aspects of people not understanding it. So that's a hard part of being out of the fog. But to jump back to when I was 20, I did reunite with my birth father at that time. I came back up to Seattle. He was in the Seattle area, and we met, and we were in contact and in reunion for about 5 years. And in that time period, he had another child. So I have a 21-year-old half brother now. And at some point during that time, we drifted away and kind of became estranged. So initial reunion was very difficult for me, and it was really hard for me to process. And an example of that is my birth father and I met in Flagstaff one time when we were connecting, and we ran into somebody that he knew, and he introduced me as his daughter. And I almost blurted out, "I'm not your daughter," because I had this very visceral reaction. And to me, my brain just could not make sense of somebody who's not my dad introducing me as his daughter. I just wasn't there yet. And when we would spend time together during those early days, I would get to the point where I would just feel so overwhelmed and like I was going to short circuit. And so I couldn't spend too much time because, I would just have this feeling coming on, like if I don't get out of here, I'm going to be curled up in the corner and not functioning. And I prefer to do that alone rather than with people, seeing that.
Mhm.
So early reunion was really difficult. And I think
I just wanted to pause you there for a sec because you said he had a son during that time as well.
he did.
So how is it seeing him parenting his other child?
I, I was just so overwhelmed with so many things that if that was a trigger, it was so much more quiet than all of the other triggers that were going off.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
It didn't really make it onto the radar,
Okay.
but
I know it is for some people,
yeah,
I've heard that before, so I just wondered.
I'm still kind of sometimes baffled by the fact that I have a half brother, and I haven't seen my birth father or my half brother in 12 to 15 years. But after I came out of the fog and realizing all of this, I called my birth father up. We periodically we might do an email or something, but very, very sparse. And so I called him up, and I actually had to look his phone number up on the internet. It wasn't even in my phone at that point. And I tracked him and found him. And I was so nervous to talk to him at first. And so it was kind of being in reunion all over again. But I started telling him what I was coming across and what was going on for me. And as part of my coming out of the fog, I started talking with my family much more about what was going on and what I was coming to understand. And so I did the same thing with him. And now we're at the point where we talk probably 2 to 3 times a month. And usually we talk for an hour and a half or 2 hours, or we talked a couple days ago over the weekend. We had like a 3-hour conversation, and now it's totally different, but it took us 20 some years to get there. And he now recognizes he didn't understand what an impact it would be for him to lose a child and the toll that would take. And when we reunited the first time, he really didn't have any understanding of the depths of what was going on for me. which created some of this disconnect between us, or some of the difficulty, because he just had no way of knowing that.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, with me talking and sharing more, and he's in a place where he's working on his own things, and so we can talk and visit and be like, well, what are you working on? What are you working on? How's it going? And it's pretty cool now.
Oh, I love that. I just have to ask because I'm just really curious. Does he still live in a commune?
No.
Okay.
he doesn't. And it's interesting. He doesn't know this. I haven't actually told any of my people. Only one friend knows that I'm doing this interview. So I don't know if he'll ever hear this or not. But before I did connect with him, we did a background check on him because we were concerned that he might be like a cult leader or involved with extreme movements. And so my family actually had a background check run on him just to make sure all was clear, and it's all clear. He's a very nice man. He's definitely kind of a hippie and unique and very different from the family that I grew up with. But also there's a lot of resonance there, with me. So it's nice to have that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm so glad that you have that back in your life now. And there's something about processing really mutual adoption trauma. Like
Right.
you mentioned, if it impacts our first parents too, even the dads. Like we talk so much about first mothers and, because they really experience the whole pregnancy and everything, but first fathers have a big loss too. And so I think it's important to talk about.
And just to mention, I had read the book, The Girls Who Go Away. I'm not sure if I'm getting the title
The Girls
correct.
Who Went Away.
Yes. And from that, really having some understanding of what happens to birth mothers, and then extrapolating on, the impact that it must have had for my birth father. And even though I had some anger and some things to work out, coming to an understanding about that and holding space for his loss and how difficult this was, I think was good for our relationship and helped us.
Well, I guess I have just really one last kind of theme of questions for you before we do recommended resources. I'm curious about if you have looked any further into connecting with your maternal side and doing a search. I don't have no idea how complex that would be, but to find your Ecuadorian roots.
Right. So I've had a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of internet research working on this, and done DNA testing. Prior to the DNA testing, I was able to find my birth mother's original birth certificate and her naturalization records. So because she was born in Panama, I found out that when the canal zone was returned or given to Panama, that all of the US documents went into the National Archives. And so I realized that I would be able to get her birth certificate, and hers was a private adoption. So I have the court records for that. And then I had this piece of paper that had what turned out to be my grandmother's name, but I was misreading the first and the last name. So when I was searching that, I wasn't finding anything. But once I found these records, I was able to see my grandmother's name and do research into the family and have made contact with them. So my grandmother passed away in the 70s, but I've talked to, it was really complex, but I've talked to what would be, I think, a first cousin once removed. So my grandmother's brother, my great uncle, his son. And it was his father that took my grandmother away to Panama to put my birth mother up for adoption. And they sent me 2 photos of my grandmother, but they haven't really told me too much about my grandmother. But the family has, from what I can tell, really significant wealth and status. And so given that, I was surprised I even got that far.
Mm-hmm.
Probably, if I want any more information, it seems like I'm going to have to go to Ecuador. And then through DNA testing, I have mostly figured out who I have a couple candidates for my grandfather, and I'm in touch with a cousin on that side, what would be my grandfather's side. And we think that his uncle is my grandfather. Was it his uncle? I can't remember. Yes, his uncle. We think his uncle would be my biological grandfather. And my closest DNA match, I think, is my birth mother's half sister through the grandfather. But I haven't been able to make contact, so he's working on that. But a lot of this is done, a lot of that searching was done through Google Translate, and a little more complex because it's South America, and I really don't know anything about Latin American culture.
Well, it sounds like you have been able to piece together quite a few different things about your birth mother. And I love that you shared, that you were able to talk to some people that, knew her. And I don't know, does that give you some sense of comfort or some sense of grounding? Like, what does just knowing these small pieces do for you?
It helps, but a lot of her story is very difficult and heartbreaking. So for me, even though it's really difficult and heartbreaking, it helped for me to see all of the trauma that she experienced. And there's a bit more than what I discussed, and realizing that I was basically grown in trauma soup. And then looking at some things about epigenetics and transgenerational trauma and realizing how much of that I took on. So it's not just my adoption trauma, but I also have my birth mother's adoption trauma. And she was faced with a lot of trauma in her life. And there's another aspect of the story that I want to share because I feel like it's important to talk about mental health and adoption and suicide, and that adoptees are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And I feel like we really need to continue to raise awareness about this. So when I was doing all of this work and this search, a friend of mine had suggested I create a timeline. And so I did that with all of the information and did a week bender on newspapers.com and just searched everybody that I could. And, you can get it free for a week. So I just went on a bender for a week and searched everything.
That's the most straight-laced bender I've ever heard of.
Yes. Well, I don't drink and I don't do drugs. So I'm left to doing things like this.
Okay.
But And so I started to piece all of this together. And when I was doing this timeline, I just picked apart every tiny detail so I could put it together. And one of the things that I came back to was this other adoptee who would have been my first cousin. And so that was my birth mother's youngest sister, the child that she placed for adoption. So we wouldn't be biologically related, but had we both been raised in our family of origin, he would be my first cousin.
And she placed him when he was 2. Is that right?
She placed him when he was 2. And so I realized in that part of my chart, it had his first name and it also had his file number through the agency. And I started thinking about it and realized here's this other adoptee who's out there, who's a second generation adoptee. In the course of doing this research, I realized that his birth mother had also passed away young. And some of the pictures that I had gotten had his birth mother in it. And in my whole story, I never really had anyone reach out to me. I did all of this myself. And I thought, wait a second, I can reach out to him and I can share pictures. And I can share some of the information that I've come to. I can share adoption resources if that's something he's interested in or open to. And so I got in touch with the adoption agency and found out that I could get a letter into his chart. And I wrote probably 20 drafts of this. realizing that I might be the first one to tell them that his birth mother had passed away. So I was trying to take out all of the triggery things and just leave it so he knew that I was out there and he could reach out to me, and, that I could provide some support and share some pictures. And then later in my search, I connected with what I call my would-be uncle. So it would be my birth mother's youngest brother, the only one still living from that line. And we finally were able to connect and have a phone conversation. And I got around to asking about this other adoptee. And he told me that he found out that probably 15 to 20 years ago, this adoptee committed suicide and jumped off a building in downtown Phoenix. And it's kind of how my story goes. Likely this will be one with a content warning at the beginning of the show. But again, I just feel like it's important that we talk about these things, because certainly in my time and in the closed adoption era, there weren't post-adoption services. One of the things I found in my chart was that when my birth father tried to reach out to the agency got in touch with my parents. My parents decided at that point that they didn't want contact, wanted to keep a closed adoption. And then I saw the letter that the agency wrote back to my birth father, and they mentioned they knew about my birth mother's suicide, but they mentioned that they thought it would be best for my parents not to tell them about that. So the focus was not at all about well-being of the child or the adoptee. The focus is on making sure the adoptive parents are comfortable. And I think that's something that your show is doing, and a lot of the adoptee voices that are coming out, helping to change that narrative and bring light to these things that are making it really difficult for us.
Well, and you mentioned, it's such a great line. You're born from trauma soup.
Yeah, grown in trauma soup.
And so was your cousin. If everything had been,
my would-be cousin.
He's still adopted. I don't know. Oh my gosh. This is I think I'm following all the lines and everything, but it's so complex. And the more we learn about trauma and that it's stored in the body and that this is part of our lineage and it's passed down generationally, in the body. I mean, this is not we're not talking about woo-woo stuff here. This is
right.
Actually starting to be scientifically proven. And you're right. I mean, we just have to have more awareness. And, you referenced that statistic that adoptees are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And, there's one study of that that's studying adolescents in one of the Midwest states, I think. And it's what else can we tell people? We're trying to talk about it. The statistics kind of show it, and yet it's still happening and things are still being buried, and it's just so maddening. So thank you for sharing. I'm sure that by you being so candid about these issues, it will allow other people to open up about the same sorts of things, because it's literally going to take each one of us telling our stories and sharing these things. And it's hard to do, as you said, the cultural gaslighting. Every time we share, we're people will say to us, oh, but you had a good life. And,
right.
Still. So that's even more re-traumatizing to us, I think, to keep hearing those things over and over. And it's tough. It is a hard road to walk. But I think if we are up for it, it's on us to hopefully spare future generations from living this life, which is it's tough. So anyway,
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I think we can do better. And I think, raising our voices together, change is coming.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. And so let's move to recommended resources, because mine is I've been back on Twitter. I had a little break there, but I'm back on Twitter and tweeting, and some people get mad when I tweet. It's really fun. It's a good time. Are you on Twitter, Donna?
I'm not. I'll get on there though.
Okay. I've been following recently a new account. In the last few months, it started up, and it is at being_adopted. And they started this hashtag being adopted means. And so adoptees just tweet just random things about what being adopted means. And this account retweets it, and I've seen tons of them retweeted throughout my feed, and it's kind of something that's sort of caught on. It's not viral or anything, but I see regularly these tweets, and I love it because they're brief. So many of them are quite poignant or clever or heartbreaking or funny. And there's a whole range. I would say most of them are more on the realistic or sometimes negative side. But there's some people who have altogether had a positive experience and are sharing that too. But what I really love about the hashtag is that there's people all the time that I've never seen them tweet before about adoption, and they just come across it and then they share something. And so that just means that, okay, so then their network has read a little tweet about it, and then their network, it's like the slow kind of spread. And I'm like, you can't see this, but I'm like kind of pushing my hands out, I'm like seeing the spider webs growing and growing further and further out. And so that's just one more thing for adoptee voices to be heard. And it's kind of a small way, but I think it has a big impact. So again, that's the hashtag is being adopted means. And then the account that started that, I think, and they are retweeting these things at being_adopted. So that would be something I recommend you check out. And Donna, you had a couple things you wanted to share.
I do.
Yeah. So why don't you go for it?
So the first one is a crisis text line, and it provides 24/7 support and will connect you with a trained crisis counselor via text.
Text.
Yeah.
Okay, that's amazing, because picking up the phone is sort of like not in my radar. I basically do everything I can to avoid talking on the phone.
Right. And when talking about these really difficult things, sometimes you need a bit of space to be able to really talk about it or reach out. So it gives you that space. It's free on major mobile carriers. It's discreet, so it's not going to show up on your phone bill. And then it's also confidential. And they have a US line and a Canadian line. So in the United States, you text 741-741. And in Canada, you text 686868. And then I think it gives you a few automated responses while it's connecting you with a crisis counselor.
That is so cool. I have not heard of that until you shared it with me. And it's so amazing. So great.
I think, given that we're talking about adoption and suicide and things like that, I've started to think about it like, I don't want to die from heart disease, and I don't want to die from cancer. I also don't want to die from suicide. And as an adoptee, knowing that my risk is higher, and having a biological relative that committed suicide, it's probably a bit higher than that. Mm. And since suicidal ideation is something that I still struggle with, I work to actively manage that and make sure that I have tools and resources to reach out to. And so I think this could be a really good one for adoptees.
Fantastic. Thank you.
My second one is a book called Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself by Kristen Neff. And self-compassion is about relating to ourselves with kindness versus harsh judgment and criticism. And for me, that's been really important in learning that. So it makes a difference, or it differentiates between self-esteem, which for me is not great, and self-compassion, which is learnable, which is, I like that I can learn that. So I don't have to have it, but I can learn it and practice it.
Yes, very good. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the research is showing for self-compassion that it is strongly related and correlated with mental well-being. So it reduces stress hormones and increases feel-good hormones like oxytocin and natural opiates. And so this is one of the resources for learning self-compassion and mindfulness that I've found helpful.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I could really use that. It has been a rough day, so I would love that. Some more
You know,
oxytocin.
I read it once 3 or 4 months ago and found it so helpful. And then in the last month or so, I've been realizing I think I need to read it again. I think I need to take another pass at that.
So good. Oh, thank you so much. Those are both awesome resources. Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And where can we connect with you online if people want to chat with you further about your story or hear more about what you're doing to take care of yourself? How can we find you?
So you can reach me through the email adoptee3@gmail.com, and that's the number 3. And then I'm also in the Your Secret Facebook group. So I don't have a Facebook public presence as an adoptee, but in the secret group or via email, I'm happy to talk with folks.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being a supporter of the show. That just means the world to me.
Well, your work and other adoptees sharing their story have had a very profound impact on me. So thank you, Haley.
This show is brought to you by my monthly Patreon supporters, and some of you are also giving one-time financial gifts. That is so hugely helpful. So thank you to each one of you who have contributed to keep this podcast going. I appreciate it so much. Adopteeson.com/partner has details of how you can support the show and keep Adoptees On going. Another way you can support the show is simply by sharing it with your friends and family. You can tell someone about it one-on-one, or share it on social media and tell people what exactly you love about the Adoptees On podcast. Helping grow the audience is an amazing way to support the show. So thank you so much for those of you who already do that. Please tag us when you share this show so I can personally come and say thank you to you for sharing the adoptee voices around the world. Thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again soon.